Let's get started, shall we? All right. So in this session, first of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you for attending the Fabric Summit. I know this is, or the Fabric Conference. I know this is a new one on our schedules, and I'm excited. Anything that's in the Australian time zone is always fun for me. So we're going to talk about unpacking the folds of fabric, a bit of a play on the fact that the product name is called Fabric. Make sure you always put Microsoft in the prefix when you're doing any Google searching or Bing searching or your favorite search engine to make sure you get answers related to Microsoft Fabric and not App Service Fabric or just fabric and sewing in general. So a little bit about me. I am a business intelligence professional or a data analytics consultant. At the moment, I think my current title is Manager of Data Engineering, which just means I do all things data, really. I used to be a software developer. I probably still am, in the back of my mind, but I've worked with the Microsoft products for over 10 years. I love doing all the application lifecycle management, database lifecycle management, huge fan of DevOps, both the methodology and, of course, the product as DevOps. And you probably see me at tech events all around the world, both virtual and in person, like this one. And in a couple of months' time, past Summit in Seattle and Definity in Australia and New Zealand. I have a whole bunch of certifications just because I kind of gamify them now. I like to learn and then challenge my learning by getting certified. And of course, I am a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, which means I love hanging out with the community and sharing my knowledge and helping upskill around the place. And you can reach me at Heidi Hasting on Twitter, or HeidiHasting.com is my blog. It is totally out of date, but I hope to get back there and get some more stuff happening. But let's talk about what we're going to do in this session. So the first thing is we're going to look at what is Fabric and sort of why use it, or perhaps why not to use it at this stage. And then we're going to look at some of the persona interactions from two different sort of spaces there, a business perspective, but also a product perspective, because they do use the persona experiences within Fabric. We're going to look at the various hubs within Fabric. So we've got the OneLake hub, the monitoring hub, and the Purview hub. And I want to be really clear on that. Purview Hub is not the same as Microsoft Purview. It's kind of like a very, very light product version, overlaps, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. But of course, you can drop questions in the chat. I can see Teams on my other screen, so I will try and answer time permitting and if I understand it, but you can always reach me on Twitter if you have any follow-up questions that I might be able to address. So, of course, what is Microsoft Fabric? Now, not to be confused with App Service Fabric, which is another Microsoft product, which is more in the application development space in Azure. So Microsoft Fabric, and I'm going to shift to the next slide, but the other things we're going to cover is some of the features, some of the benefits, and some of how it overlaps with the current data landscape around the place, and a little bit of a comparison with other data platforms, more so on the Microsoft side. So if you've never heard about Fabric, it is a SaaS platform. So SaaS being software as a service, you can think of it like the Office 365 for data. So we've got all these different offerings within the one data analytics platform, and it is all software as a service. So previously, you might have worked with Azure Data family. So in the Azure portal, you might have looked at Synapse, you might have looked at Data Factory, you might have looked at storage accounts. Those are considered platform as a service. And you get to do a lot of the integrations and networking between them. With Fabric, it's all available in the One Analytics platform. So we're not having to do the networking and integrations between all these. They're just more like features of the one product. So you've got your data integration perspective. So with that, we do things like Data Factory pipeline equivalents, but they call them, it's still called Data Factory pipelines, but it is not feature parity with Azure Data Factory pipelines, just to be very clear there. But you can use over 150 connectors, and you can do that drag and drop experience to be able to move your data from various source systems into the Fabric platform. With that, you can do both on-prem and cloud. Then we've got the data engineering. So with data engineering, that enables us to work with things like notebooks. So think about that from a Spark perspective. If you've got any Spark people in your organization, they can be writing Python or PySpark in notebooks in the data engineering experience. We've got the data science experience, which is where we can do things like machine learning models, we can do experiments, we can use the exact same data that all the others are using, so we're no longer having to copy the data all over the place to be able to allow our data scientists to be able to, create their models, train their models, deploy them, and incorporate it into our overall analytics platform. We have the data warehouse experience, which is where we can do things very similar to sort of your Azure SQL DB or your Azure SQL DW that existed in the PaaS space. But in the Fabric space, it's all Delta Parquet underneath. So it's all using the open source format. So instead of being like MDF, LDF files for a traditional sort of database stack, we're using all open source underneath. So with the data warehousing, we could do RT SQL development. We can have things like store procedures and views. We can have functions. We can do row level security. We can do schema security. We can do a lot of the things that we're familiar with using on the Azure Data Platform in the PaaS world. We've got the real-time analytics, so that's called sort of more real-time insights, I think is its current name, and that's where we can do our IoT streaming data. We can do streaming data in Power BI as well, but it's more for your IoT sensor data where you might want to consume, say, Event Hub data or Apache Kafka data, or in fact, anything that's going to be data that's intermittently introduced into your data estate. So it's not necessarily on a schedule, or it's not something that can be triggered via, say, a file existing in a location like a storage account, but more ingesting in, say, telemetry data, weather data, even Fabric event data, which is pretty cool. With Power BI, that's our visualization product in the stack. It's where we can build reports, we can do dashboards, we can take our data, model it, and create insights from it. And then that allows our organization to take action from that data. We've also got Data Activator, which is a brand new product in the data world for us, is that it's allowing us to take actions from our data. So if you think about, you've got a data set, it might be, say, you know, your local service station has a number of fridges in it. Those fridges have got temperatures. That temperature data is getting flowed through to our analytics platform. We can set up alerting so that if the fridge temperature goes over a particular threshold, then fire off a series of actions. So we do that with Data Activator. We can say, hey, create a reflex within Data Activator that says assess for these data points, whether it's, you know, a trend, a couple of data points have reached a certain threshold over time, or it's, you know, as soon as it goes above a threshold, then take actions. And those actions can be more in line with the Power Automate action side of the fence. But it's pretty cool. Something we don't really have in the other data platforms in the PaaS space for Azure, but we do have it within Fabric. It is still in preview though, just to warn everyone. And underneath all these different experiences is actually what they call the OneLake. Now, if you think of OneLake is not something you really see directly, but you interact with it as your storage layer. So OneLake's based on ADSL Gen 2. It is, you can segment it up. So for each Fabric tenant, there is the OneLake, but within the OneLake, you can have multiple capacities on our tenant, and those capacities can be based in different regions, which means our OneLake sort of containers are in different regions if we want them to be or need them to be. But effectively, what having all that data in the OneLake means as soon as we bring data into the Fabric SaaS offering, it's available to all the different experiences. So we can have the data factory pipeline bringing data from, say, on-prem into Fabric, and then we can use data warehouse to then go process that data into, say, an integrated, you know, cleansed format, and then we can put a semantic model on top of that and model it, and then we can have Power BI reporting off it, and it's all using the same OneLake area. It's that unified platform there. And not to distinguish, not to lose sight of the fact that governance is very, very important. We can also have Purview data governance across the Fabric stack. It is incorporated from the perspective of the Microsoft Information Protection, and also things like data lineage and inventories, and looking at what is in your tenant. But the full Purview capability is something it integrates with, because you can scan a Microsoft Fabric tenant, but it's still a separate product in the full Purview. So having, you know, what used to be Risk and Compliance Center and Microsoft Purview with its data cataloging feature, those are still a separate product, but you can scan your Fabric tenant and therefore put your Fabric items into a collection inside a Purview. And we can do our data governance. Now, if you think comparatively, that was the SaaS platform that is Fabric, end-to-end analytics, all in one, good, bad, or otherwise. Now, if we compare that to other products on the market, we would have to do a number of different products to achieve the same ecosystem, and then we have to integrate all those different products. So if I wanted to do a Power BI report with a Synapse, serverless pool and Azure Data Storage and some Data Factory pipelines, I'm looking at 4 different products with 4 different licensing models, and then I have to figure out how to integrate all of them. And when you introduce things like private endpoints across the Azure Stack in PaaS, it's a lot of complexity there. What the difference is to do those same things on the SaaS offering, you don't get as many, that what they refer to as like knobs that you can toggle, because it is a SaaS platform, but it removes some of the complexity in trying to get all the different experiences integrated, and it eliminates the need to copy data around all over the place. So if we look at what an end-to-end might look like inside Fabric, we can do our data integration, we can do our data storage, we can use Spark engines if we want to for our compute and transformations, we can use more traditional techniques with data warehouse, we can use real-time analytics, and we can have real-time streaming batch all together on the one analytics platform. We can then do our data science on the same data, and we can enable our Power BI reporting, and of course do our governance. So end-to-end always looks different for different projects, different companies, and you don't have to do the one end-to-end. So just because Fabric is offering all these different experiences doesn't mean you have to use them all. Just means they're there. And by enabling Fabric, you're enabling all of them, except for Copilot, because that's F64 and above. But we'll talk about that some more. So when we talk about the OneLake, as I said, it's a bit of a logical thing in that you don't physically interact with it. There is the OneLake Explorer, but otherwise OneLake is there behind the scenes storing all our data. It's a single data storage solution for everything, and there is the one per tenant. So all the workloads that exist within Fabric are all interacting with the same OneLake storage. If we look at it in terms of the compute, we can do T-SQL, we can do Spark, we can do KQL or Custo query language, and we can also use the analysis services to do our interacting with our data. So I think where this plays a part in your data platforms is if you were to say, take our earlier example using Synapse, maybe even Azure SQL and storage, we might be limited to either going T-SQL or Spark, sort of one or the other. And we might be limiting ourselves, whereas when we're in Fabric, we can use all of them if we need to. We don't have to, but we have the option. And so if you've got multidiscipline teams, or you might have a new ETL developer who's really good at Python, then you can capitalize on that strength of them doing Python. They can work with notebooks against the data. If you have other team members or business users who need more of a low-code, no-code experience, they can be doing pipelines or what's called Dataflow Gen 2, which is a little bit similar to Power Query in Power BI Desktop. If we look now to our different personas, so these are just general examples of different personas that work in our data estates. We've got things like data analysts. They want to do querying, they want to access the data, they might not know where the data lives, so that's where things like Purview Hub are good for them to explore, or even the OneLake Hub, which we will go into. You've got your data engineers who can be doing multiple disciplines. They could be doing T-SQL, they could be doing pipeline development, they might be doing Dataflow Power Query, they might even be doing PySpark or Spark SQL. Our data scientists, you're doing our machine learning, they might want to integrate with cognitive services. Apologies for the background noise, the gardeners are doing some maintenance. We've got our IT administrators, that could be our cloud admin, that could be our Office 365, it could be our global admin. In the case of Power BI Fabric, it's the Fabric admin as well. We've got our data modelers who will do our semantic models, and we've also got our visual storyteller personas. So all these different personas can work with the one analytics SaaS platform. So now you don't have to install, 50 million products in your organization to be able to work with the different roles that exist in your business. When we look at it inside Fabric, this is the Fabric landing page or the home page. And within that, you've got the different, what they call experiences. So as you toggle the different experiences, this makes the different menus shortlisted or contextually aware of what experience you're in. So if I'm in the Power BI experience, my new menu would include things like Power BI report and dashboard, whereas if I'm in the data factory experience, it will include things like pipelines. Doesn't mean that I can't create the other items, it just means they sort of remove the complexity of the new menus by giving you a bit of context. And we'll have a look at this in more detail in the demos. But these personas and experiences slightly overlap with business roles, but not one for one. And there's some other context, so we'll go through it. So another way to break down the different experiences is things like data integration, engineering, and warehouse are where you would look to do move and transform activities. If you were looking to do analysis and take actions, you'd be looking at data activator, Power BI. If you're looking to take insights and work out patterns within your data, that's where the data science experience is going to fit in. So if we look now at our data engineer role, so this is like, think of it as your business role within your organization. So if we had a data engineer, we'd expect them to probably be doing data ingestion, and that ingestion might be batch. It might be real time or near real time is more common. It might be using pipelines or it might be using notebooks. If we're doing data transformation work, they could be using data flows or notebooks, but we want them to have the ability to either do low code, no code style transformations or go quite complex. They can also do data flow Gen 2, which is kind of similar style of thing to the Power Query, whereas in Azure Data Factory, you would have had mapping data flows. That experience isn't translatable to Fabric so much. They can also query the data. They may be using T-SQL or Python. You can even use things like R and PySpark. And they may want to do alerting. But alerting I see as sort of a multi-disciplined role that goes across a varying assortment of roles. You might have business users who do this. Now, this is looking at it from a generic data engineer. Your organization may have different factors that they do for a data engineer. Your organization might have more like a unicorn persona, where that's someone who wears multiple hats. They may be your data engineer, your data architect, your tenant admin, your cloud admin, all the things in one. So I've just broken it down a little bit more into specific personas that I might experience. And so when those personas are working with Fabric, so they're going to use Data Factory experience. So they're going to look at doing the data flow Gen 2, the pipeline. Data workflow here is what's called Apache Airflow. It's the ability to put Apache Airflow activities within Fabric. We've got the data warehouse experience. So we've got our warehousing we talked about earlier. The other thing that's been introduced with Fabric is what's called mirroring. Mirroring is not the same as Azure SQL mirroring or SQL Server mirroring. It's slightly different in that you can mirror an Azure SQL database or a Snowflake or a Cosmos DB. And it's kind of like a 3-click thing where you say, hey, I want to create a mirror of an Azure SQL. You tell it which Azure SQL database you want and which destination lakehouse within Fabric you want to use. And then that will automatically create kind of like a metadata-driven ETL. It'll create the ETL solution to copy the data from the Azure SQL over to Fabric in the lakehouse as Delta Parquet formatted files. So it takes care of that sort of initial ingestion for you, which if you're doing medallion architecture might be considered your bronze or your raw or your landing layer. And it does it sort of in a couple of clicks. And it maintains that ETL design. Not all data sources available. I know a lot of people have asked about on-prem, but you'll see that it's not here. But always with any of the functionality in Fabric, watch the roadmap because there's always new things getting added all the time. If we look at our data engineering, we've got our lakehouse there. We've got the notebooks. Notebooks exist in both data engineering and a few other experiences because it is common across them. Environments are where you can do stored centrally what packages you might want to allow in your notebooks to be used within the workspace. Our Spark job definitions, so we can put our notebooks into a job, and our API for GraphQL. And with the real-time intelligence, we've got our event house. So event house is the containerization storage for the KQL database. So when you create an event house, it'll automatically create a KQL database, and you can create multiple KQL databases on the event house. But more broadly, the 3 main storage ones is the lakehouse, the warehouse, and the event house. Now, the why you pick each one is contingent on what you want to do or dependent on what you want to do within your organization and within your solution. So I like to think of lakehouses where my data just goes to chill out. It's kind of most common in my landing zones. Warehouse is kind of like your physical warehouse in real life. It's where your data goes to be organized and structured and, restricting access. Now, you can still do that in the lakehouse, but you get additional functionality that's only available for T-SQL people, whereas T-SQL on the lakehouse is a read-only endpoint. It's not something you can modify. You can create a view, but that's about as far as you can go. And the event house, because it is that streaming data, I always think of it as it's where the data goes to party. Data's coming in and out at different frequencies, and then we can either process it on the way in, we can have it, fly in and stored, and we can integrate across the three. But those three are where your data is doing your storage. Whereas when you want to move data around, now you don't need to move it around once it's in Fabric. You can have the one copy approach. But if you need to move it from other platforms, so you might go hybrid where you've got a Databricks environment writing to an ADSL Gen 2, you can use things like Pipeline, like Dataflow Gen 2, like the streaming data sets, other ways to move the data into the Fabric platform. And then once it's in there, there's the concept of shortcuts. You don't see it here because it's not an item. These are considered items within those experiences, and each item has its own functionality and how it can integrate across. And I've just realized I forgot to tell you all that with Fabric, I should just clarify this, and it's not in one of the slides. So with Fabric, you've got what's called a tenant, and then within a tenant, you have capacities. Capacities is like your available compute controls. And then within a capacity, you can attach one or more workspaces. And then within the workspaces is where you create the Fabric items. So it's a very similar structural design to what you would have seen in Power BI if you've used Power BI before, where you'd have reports that are in workspaces that are in a tenant. So that's our data engineer experience. Now let's go have a look at the actual product for a minute, shall we? So this is the Fabric interface. It is SaaS, so we got app.fabric.microsoft.com. If you were to go app.powerbi.com, it would redirect to Fabric anyway, and would just put an experience on the end there. If we go into one of the experiences, so let's say we want to go into data engineering, and we'll go into a workspace. I already have a workspace sitting on a trial capacity. And so this little diamond used to be just Power BI premium per user sort of thing. Now it will say Fabric. So in order for you to work with Fabric items, they have to be in a workspace backed by a Fabric capacity. And you will see the trial there. You can use trials for Fabric, and those are trial capacities. So I have a trial capacity I'm using here, and I can tell that this workspace is using it because in the settings on the workspace under license information, we will see here when it loads, trial. If we weren't using a trial, we could select Fabric capacity, and then there'd be the option to pick our capacity. But to provision those capacities, you do it over in the Azure world. So that's more of an IT administrator persona. Inside my workspace, I've got a number of items. I've got the Lakehouse. So within the Lakehouse, you'll see here there's a semantic model and a SQL analytic endpoint. What this means is anytime you create a Lakehouse, it automatically creates a default semantic model, hence the bracket default, for you. And that semantic model can automatically add tables as you add them to the Lakehouse. That is a configurable option. And you can go in and edit the relationships in that model if you like. So that is like a semantic model that you would have seen within Power BI. It's just automatically connected to the Lakehouse. So you don't have to create the model and connect it. It's automatically there. You can add additional semantic models, as you'll see with this one, so I don't have to use the default one. And at the moment, I tend to avoid the default one. It's a little bit buggy. The SQL analytic endpoint means that for this Lakehouse, I can use T-SQL to query it and connect to it. So within the Lakehouse, you can go in and get the connection string here. So I can get this connection string and I can work with it in other tooling that supports a SQL connection. But if I go into the Lakehouse, this one is erroring. Now, if you go through the demo tutorial, I will warn you that at the moment, the experience I have found is if I create a new Lakehouse and turn on the preview feature, which I will show you, new Lakehouse, this little feature toggle here, at the moment, if you do that and do one of the tutorials on Lakehouse, it will tend to not display the table. So if you ever get a bit of buggy behavior, just check what you've done different to the tutorials or what you've done different to the docs. But this one I've created without that. And you'll see I've already loaded a dimension customer table in. Ignore the numbers, that's just demo. So here we can see a preview of the data. So if I was a data engineer persona, I might create a Lakehouse and go in and say, yep, I want to get data. I'm going to do it with Dataflow Gen 2, for example. And then when this loads, this will load a Dataflow Gen 2. I can then say I want to get data, and my data is going to come from a CSV file, and I'm going to upload the file. I'm not going to do that because I've actually already done it, but you have a number of options to ingest in the data. And whilst this is the low code approach, the sort of drag and drop, click and drop here, You can do it more of a metadata-driven approach if you're using the pipelines, and you can make those parameterized. You can use Copilot if you have F64 and above to help you create the different data ingestion solutions you want to use. But if I go back out, and data flow is one of the few modal things, so in order to switch with the multitasking experience here, you actually have to close it. It won't let you switch while it's there. But if I load one I've already done, so we're going to do load Lakehouse tables 2. So this would be where our data engineers sort of are working. So they've loaded in, we've got our source here, which is actually my CSV file that's been uploaded to a SharePoint location. And then I'm going to promote the headers, and then I'm going to change some data types, and I'm going to store it in the destination being the lakehouse. Doesn't have to be a lakehouse, you can switch to other connections there, but this one is a lakehouse. And then when you publish and run that, that's going to ingest the data into the lakehouse, into our Delta table, so we can then work with it. Now, as we talked about before, we've got the SQL endpoint within the browser here. We can swap to the SQL endpoint via the lakehouse directly, and we can go ahead and write a query. Now, any query you create here, so if I do new SQL and I type one in, I'll just click one for added benefit here, and we can run this and it'll display it in the browser. Now, any file you create, so anytime you do new SQL, it's going to save it here automatically. So watch out for the fact that a lot of this is autosave. But it means our engineers could be in here creating views because a lakehouse supports views. Or if they're not in here doing views, they might be in doing modeling. So our data modelers could be in here. This model is actually the default one. So I can navigate to it via the lakehouse directly, or I can navigate to it from the workspace list. If I'm in the model, I can go ahead and drag and drop things. I'm not going to, but you can drag and drop and create relationships here, all within the browser. And these tables are going to be direct lake integrated. So when you look at the storage mode, it's direct lake, which is the new one introduced with Fabric. Before, Power BI semantic models only had direct query and import mode now, and of course hybrid, but now we've got the direct lake mode. But I'm sure there's a number of sessions in today's presentations about that. So you've got here, I always ignore these ones. These are like query performance tuning type things, you know, seeing what sessions are active to your lakehouse and what queries people are running. If we go into another workspace I've got one with a warehouse. So we can go in and interact with the warehouse in the browser. So same thing, the warehouse also creates a default semantic model and a SQL endpoint. So if we go into our wide world importers here, we've now got more of a sort of SQL server, T-SQL, Azure SQL space. So you can see we've got schemas, we've got schema names, we've got tables, we've got views, we've got store procedures, we've got functions, and I've just created some. You can then edit these in the browser. So I can go ahead and, you know, have a look at what that store procedure definition is. Not all T-SQL functionality is available within Fabric, but it is there. So if you're working with data engineers who are more familiar with, or it's a better approach for them to use SQL and use store procedures, then you can do that within the warehouse experience. You can also create views. The thing to watch for with views in both Lakehouse and Warehouse, whilst they're really cool and do really awesome things, they mean that if you do a semantic model, the semantic model query will fall back from direct lake mode back to direct query mode by default. It's one of the limitations at the moment. We can also do security, and at any time I create a new SQL file here, it's also going to save it in this list. So just do a bit of tidy up every so often, but I might have some shared queries that I want to share with my team as a data engineer. I can create a shared query and put it into the shared queries, and that means anyone who's got access into this warehouse can go access the warehouse. I can even turn it into a SQL database project, store it in Azure DevOps, and do my usual CI/CD that I might have done in other PaaS-based platforms. So that's where our data engineer is going to play. And hopefully I see no questions so far, but you're welcome to ask questions anytime. With our data scientists, they're going to do things like data discovery and exploration. They're going to prepare data potentially. They might need to make some additional changes. They might be working off the raw data, doing some hypothesis. They're going to build experiments, models, train the models, look at doing forecasting, and then make all that available in an end-to-end platform. So when you saw Fabric there and I had a warehouse or a lakehouse, I could then make some of that data available to a separate workspace, put my data scientists in that workspace, or give them access to it, not put them in, give them access to it. And then they can access the data in there in sort of a contained way and build their data science solutions, but they're accessing the same data from the OneLake storage underneath. With the data modelers and visualizations, so they're going to do the same thing. They're going to query data, they're going to explore data, but they're also going to build reports and build dashboards, and they're going to do modeling. So they can do that within the browser, or they can do it with Power BI Desktop. So I could have a data engineer that's curated all the data, put it through a number of lakehouses. We might have a bronze lakehouse, a silver lakehouse, a gold lakehouse, and then we can make that available to our data modelers and visualizations. And we can do that within the one workspace, or we can do it across into multiple workspaces. So you've seen, and if I switch back, and I'll also show you where you can create the semantic model. So you see here, I've got a number of workspaces with different tutorials in them. These are the publicly available end-to-end tutorials that I was sort of having a play with. So I could have a workspace, say this lakehouse one, this might be by bronze lakehouse. I might have my bronze and my silver in the same workspace, and then I might have gone and put a separate workspace for my gold layer if I was doing medallion. And a lot of times when you're looking at how you split the workspaces, it's either by security or by consumption. So each of these experiences is going to use consumption out of the capacity. So if I've got data engineers, data scientists, Power BI report developers, and consuming business users consuming the reports, everything from that workspace is going to use the capacity it's associated with to be able to provide the compute power for it. And then those capacities, because they can have multiple workspaces, that might mean I need to be conscious of, do I want to put my data engineering workload on a different capacity? So my data engineers are using that capacity consumption, and I put my reports in a different one so that it's got a different level of capability and performance and availability. I might have, 10, 20, 30,000 users, or, I might just have 10. And so I might want my Power BI reporting in a different workspace so that I can provide access via an app. And I might not want my data scientists, my data engineers, and my, Power BI report developers in the same workspace, because the workspace access that you can provide is very limiting. You can only do admin, member, contributor, or viewer. So when it comes to a workspace level, I can't say, hey, I only want my data engineer persona to access the warehouse, and I want my data analyst persona to access the lakehouse, or I don't want my data scientist to be able to edit the pipelines. You can't do that at the workspace level. At the item level, I can of course share the item, but item level permissions are way more linear. And so when you get to that level, you can say, all right, I'm going to share this pipeline with just the data engineers. But that can get a bit complex when you look at doing things like source control, because the source control is at the workspace level. So I can do what's called Git integration. So I can integrate my workspace with Azure DevOps or GitHub and source control a number of the items here. So if I'm going to do that, I'd probably prefer to do workspace permissions than individual item permissions, but it is possible. And to complicate things even further, each compute engine, so inside the warehouse where I have more granular options, I can do SQL permissions, so I can make it quite granular as to what people have access to. Lakehouse also has a granular permission model that I think is still in preview, where you can grant access to a particular set of folders or and files or tables. And then Event House, similar again. So you've got different permissions that you can put inside those experiences on top of the workhouse plus the workspace plus the item. So you've got tenant permissions, capacity permissions, workspace permissions, item permissions, and inside item permissions. And similarly with the Power BI semantic model and the Power BI report, the semantic model, you might put row level security on inside that semantic model. And then the Power BI reporting, you might publish out with an app. So then you've got the app, audiences, and security model there. So you've got a number of different options for the different experiences. So when you are looking at where am I going to put things, you might look at the security you're going to apply or the compute that it's going to use. And of course, if you're using Copilot, F64, Copilot is quite a hungry consumption unit thing, but our different personas are going to work differently. In the same way that our data modelers, when they come in to access it, they're probably going to be building the semantic models. So you'll notice there's nowhere in this menu, when we look at all the different personas, there's nowhere here that it actually lists the semantic model, which can be confusing initially because you're probably looking at it going, but I don't want to use the default one necessarily. I want to be able to separate out my modelers from my data engineers who are doing the ETL transformations and everything. But when you're within a workspace, so if I go into my lakehouse and I open up my number 2 lakehouse because it works, you'll see here on the menu we can create a semantic model that way. So I can create a new semantic model just by clicking that, and I can say this is the lakehouse. Spelled that right? Yep. Semantic model, and we'll call it 2. And then I can say within that lakehouse, I want to show this table. If you ever don't see anything here, check the filtering. Sometimes there is filtering on to only show tables or views. So make sure you've removed filtering before you select. So I can say I would like the dimension customer to be available in this semantic model. And then I could give access to this semantic model to my modeling team, and they can come in and modify the semantic model and put relationships in and add measures and things of that nature. Now, while that's spinning wheeling, give it a moment. And warehouse is the same. So if you're in warehouse, you can create the new semantic model. And remember we talked about at the start that it's all in one. So you never saw me get a connection string to be able to create this model to the source data in the lakehouse. It's already integrated for me. So now I have my new semantic model, lakehouse semantic model. I can use the information protection labels if I wanted to apply a label to that model. And then if I look back in my lakehouse workspace and hit the lineage view, we should be able to see that now our warehouse 2 has a different, scroll to the right, zoom in a little smidge. So now you can see my lakehouse semantic model is using my lakehouse 2. So you see the lineage there, but we haven't got any reports off it. If we were inside that semantic model now and we were doing report visualization, let's say I was working in the finance team, our modeler had created a finance model, we can go into that model, have a look at the details, and we can go ahead and create a report. So I might go, hey, just being a little bit lazy today, let's auto create a report, have it pre-can a report up for me. I could build one from scratch if I wanted to as well and customize the look and feel. But I'm going to cheat and allow Power BI to do its thing. But now we can go in and edit this model. So edit this report. So this report is now available. And again, you didn't see me create any connection strings. So I didn't have to go to Power BI desktop and say connect to a model and then drag and drop and build it. It's all built here. But I can go ahead and export this or save it, download a copy of it, and then I can work with it in Power BI desktop if I wanted to. But I can save this to my workspace and go, yep, let's put it in the tutorial workspace. We're going to say this is Lakehouse Report 2. So if you think about our different persona experiences, our data modeler and visualization person is probably going to come straight into a semantic model. So they might not see everything in this workspace. We might have put certain things in a different workspace, like the semantic models. So our data engineer might have done our lakehouse and our warehouse and everything. And then we might have put the semantic model in a different workspace and then gave our modelers access to that, and the same with our report developers. But then the report developer can go put that into an app and publish that out so our business consuming users can go just access the app. Good call out, David. You can use the Q&A functionality for questions. Oh, that's in the Teams thing. I thought you were using the Q&A for the visuals. You can use Q&A inside Fabric as well. But yeah, you're welcome to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature of Teams if you've not used it before. It's in the top ribbon area. Thanks, David, for the call out. So now with that experience, we can go in, we can do our visualizations, we can do our report development. If we wanted to query it, so we could, if we were given access to the lakehouse, we might be given access to the SQL Analytic endpoint, and I probably shouldn't pick the one that's broken because that will not work well. Close that, go to the second one. If you've never used this multitasking experience, by the way, if you hit 10 items, it will warn you to say you've got too many things open. And you just go in and close them, which I might do so I can have a fresh little multitask menu. Close, 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 and be mindful that most things in Fabric, not all, but most, are auto-saving behind the scenes. So if you just make little changes just to explore things, sometimes it saves them. And other times you create new queries and you end up with this gamut of new query window. So if we go into our SQL Analytic endpoint here, we can query it. Now, this might not be the only way, though. As an analyst, we might go, well, this is all well and good, right? But, the browser is one thing and I can write my query, but I love having, you know, my IntelliSense. So we can say select star from dimension.customer. Now, if you've ever used SQL Server on-prem and you're familiar with the concept of link servers, Fabric has a similar concept in that whilst I'm looking at this particular warehouse in this particular workspace, so in this case, Lakehouse 2 inside Tutorial Lakehouse, I could add another Lakehouse or warehouse from another workspace and query across workspaces. And you just sort of need to prefix them. So it might be like Lakehouse 1, as my computer locks up. You know, so when I'm going to query across, you got to specify what you're accessing and the schema. So you can do cross workspace queries as well if you need to. If you've got data sitting in one workspace and data sitting in a different one, you can go across them. But I might want to use my preferred tool of choice like Azure Data Studio to work with this. I can go in here and look at the connection string. So I can copy the SQL connection string. And if we scroll all the way to the end, you'll see like datawarehouse.fabric.microsoft.com. So we can go ahead and copy that, and we can go into our favorite tool of choice, in my case, Azure Data Studio, and I've already got a connection here. But what this would be is you do a new connection, leave it as SQL Server, don't switch it to connection string, even though the menu item in Fabric said connection string, leave it as parameters. And then the authentication type is going to be your Entra ID because it's like your Office 365, your email address, UPN type thing. And then you authenticate and we can go ahead and connect. That will then allow me to access my workspace contents and I can get into my particular warehouse or lakehouse or event house, keyword database, and I can look at the tables and I could query them inside Azure Data Studio. Oh, new error for today. You have to take my word for it. So that would allow us to query it that way. Or if I was, more familiar with Power BI Desktop and I thought, yep, I want to do Power BI Desktop, I can do get data and go SQL Server. I probably should have zoomed in on that. And then I can paste in here, I can paste that data warehouse.fabric, import or direct query, and just go OK. And then when it asks for the credentials, we're going to use a Microsoft account. I'm going to sign in. It's going to ask me to sign in. So this will probably pop up on another window. Let me zoom out while that comes up, and I'll just authenticate here. It's probably going to two-factor while I'm at it. Cool. And then connect. And then that's going to let me know what I've got available. So inside that particular workspace, I've got my Lakehouse 2, I've got my Lakehouse 1, so let's go Lakehouse 2. And I can pick the data sets from there. And then I can build a Power BI report. And annoyingly, you always get these internal ones, but mine's Dimension Customer. And so I can go ahead and load that into my Power BI report. I already have one, so it'll actually load it secondary. And you can build your Power BI report and then publish this up to the service. So I can use other tooling. I might use RStudio, might use PowerShell. There's also the option if you want to integrate with, if you've got business users or you've got an analyst doing some ad hoc query work, they can access the OneLake Explorer. Let's see if I happen to have that running behind the scenes. I do. So the OneLake Explorer is a bit like a file explorer view. So we can go into our workspaces. So you'll see here it's OneLake. You can't see my toolbar, but it looks like a little bloom picture in the toolbar. A bloom picture. It looks like the OneLake picture, which is, let me see if I can do this. Screenshot. Oops, screenshot it and show you. So I should be able to screenshot it. Here we go. And I'll just bring that to the other window. So you'll see it's this tiny little blue circly thing. So that appears in the toolbar, and when you double click on it and open it, you go access the OneLake Explorer, and then you have to install this, by the way, the OneLake Explorer, and then I can go into my Lakehouse workspace and I can go into my Lakehouse and I could drop files in there. So Lakehouse is one of the options that supports files. So I can drop Parquet files in there, I could drop CSV files in there, I could drop text files in there, I could drop a video file in there if I wanted. You can turn it into a bit of a swamp. Highly recommend putting some governance in there to avoid that. But you can think about how your business user persona, if they need to supply a file to the data analytics team to do some analysis ad hoc, you might make a Lakehouse available for them to be able to connect to in a workspace to just drop ad hoc files in, and then as an analyst, you can then pick that file up and use it for your work. As an engineer, you might take that same file and use it as part of the engineering process. So this file section, it's the same as going in here and saying upload when it wants to give me the menu. And of course, my Zoom's not going to let me. So we could go in and upload here, and you'll notice there's nothing that says what files you can't do. If you give it a Parquet file, it automatically knows to translate that into a table. If you don't, you give it like a CSV file, it just puts it as a CSV file, and then you've got to use one of the other data movement transformation tools, whether it's Pipeline, Dataflow Gen 2, or Notebook, to be able to take that CSV file and convert it to a table. Sorry, they're running a leaf blower right outside my unit. Hopefully that's not coming through on the audio. All right, so that is our visualization and modeling perspective. And so you can see we can do what we would have done with Power BI, but then we can extend that into the Microsoft Fabric space. And we did a bit of a demo. We've also got other personas that might work with the Fabric product. So our business users, so they could also connect Excel to Fabric, and they could be interacting with the warehouse, the lakehouse, the event house, the KQL databases. They could be querying the data, they could be viewing the data, they could be accessing reports. There's any number of options there. And our IT administrator or our cloud admin or whoever's in that sort of persona within the organization, they might be doing things like tenant administration, capacity administration. Domain is something specifically to Fabric, and they might do user access. So if we look just briefly, because not everyone's seen the tenant settings, if you go into the settings of Fabric in the admin portal, this is where you see all the tenant settings. If you're not a tenant admin, you will only see capacity settings, but only for the capacities you have, like a trial. If you're a tenant admin, you can go in and see all the different tenant settings. So you can toggle on and off. And if there are new settings added since the last time you accessed it, it will show them up the top. But we can also go and search. So let's say we wanted to check what the settings were for Copilot. We've got the option to toggle these on and off. If you turn off Copilot, because you've got to be mindful that sometimes the data can go outside your region, especially if you're in Australia like myself. So you may want to toggle that off. Or if you're a user using GitHub as your source control of choice, because Azure DevOps is sort of the out-of-the-box default one, GitHub to enable it, you need to enable it at the tenant level. So this would be where your IT admins or your data analytics admins, if they control the Fabric tenant, are there. Domains is where you can put in like business domains and subdomains. So if you're doing a data mesh style strategy, or you're just segregating out your different domains of access, you can do that inside domains. So once the domain is available, you can specify who the admin is, what security groups link to it, and then that gets associated to workspace or workspaces. Capacities is where you can see the different Fabric capacities. As I mentioned earlier, I have a trial, so under the trial, I can see the trial capacity that's there. I can also see I have a number of other Fabric capacities that are paused. When a capacity is paused, the items are not accessible. So at the moment, I can't access the workspaces attributed to these capacities because I've paused it, but pausing it means I'm not spending all my money in one hit. But that's another setting there. So I think the trial, there's a multitude of trials. So just be mindful in your org, if someone sets up a trial, it does a capacity. So you can actually grant users access to that capacity rather than have everyone enable a trial. It is limited, the number of people who can do a trial per tenant. So and it's not a large number. You've also got your previous Power BI premium capacities and your embedded. So those are things at a tenant level. And then within the workspace, you may have admins that are looking at the workspace permissions, or you might delegate those down. So capacity admin, you can delegate to people as well. But inside the workspace access, I may have put different people as the admin, not necessarily my IT person, but my IT person might be the one who creates the workspaces, because you can control who has permission to do the workspaces. Now, last but not least, the hubs. Let's race through the hubs. So we got the OneLake hub, and that should not have a space in it. We got the monitoring hub, and we got the Purview hub. So the OneLake hub is anytime we create data sets, so that could be our lake houses and our warehouses, or it might be our semantic models. Those are then surfaced and viewable in the OneLake hub. Think of it kind of like a data catalog, but not with all the bells and whistles and features. Like it's not going to give you all the descriptions about what's in these different OneLake data sets. Our monitoring hub is where we can look at, hey, we've got a pipeline that's run. How did it go? What was its performance? Did it error? And we can look at it more broadly across our tenants. So if we're looking at multiple workspaces that include our data analytics end-to-end solutions, we might have pipelines running in one workspace, notebooks running in another one, and we might have semantic models in another one, and we need to see them more holistically. You can't see the data flow in the monitoring hub. You can see the data flow Gen 2 though. And Spark includes extra things. So this is the monitoring hub. This is where we can go in and see more details about the different things that are going to run or execute or refresh. And we can click into them and get more details, as well as find out what location, which is what workspace they're in, and whether they were successful or failed. We can also filter that view, so we can look at overnight, what's failed, and see if we can correct it. And then within the Purview Hub, that's our ability to see a bit of an inventory of our tenant, and more closely, what are the sensitivity labels associated with our tenant. So if you're not using this feature, it's somewhat useless. But if you are using that feature, it's great, especially if you're doing a bit of an audit to work out how many how many items have got sensitivity labels on, or are things being misclassified because we've got a high number on different sensitivity labels versus others. It also means we can explore if someone says, oh, I'm looking at this report, and you're like, where the heck is that report? You can use the item explorer to be able to find it. So if I load Fabric again, the way to get to this is either through the gear and hit Purview Hub. When you do that, after the first time, it will create the admin monitoring workspace, and within that is a pre-can report. So within this report, I can see all my items and what sensitivity label they have, and I'll zoom out slightly. I'll do the browser zoom out. There we go. Oh, that might be a bit little. Okay, so we can go in here and we can see what are the sensitivity labels that have been applied across our tenant. Now, this is not accessible to everyone, which is a little bit annoying. So just be mindful of that. I can see it because I'm the tenant admin on my tenant, so I can see everything in my tenant. I can also go in and look at the item explorer. I can see what's been endorsed in terms of data sets. Within the explorer, I might want to know, hey, let's go look at where someone's gone and created a lake house. And then that will then show me all the lake houses in my tenant, as well as what workspaces they're in. They're not hyperlinked, so I can't just click them and link in, but they are there. If we look at that monitoring hub, I like the monitoring hub because I can quickly see, okay, has my Dataflow Gen 2 run? Yes, it did. And then I can go in and view bit details about that run. So you get different stats. Now, if that was a Spark notebook, if it was a notebook that I run, you get different details. In the same way, pipeline and Dataflow Gen 2 get different details. With pipeline, I can go in and actually look at the execution, which is very similar to what you might have seen on Azure Data Factory in the Azure world, in the PaaS world, if you've seen that before. And then for the ones that are Spark notebooks, if there's a failure within the notebook, you get to see the debug, not debug, but the output of those error messages in the run. In the same way, I can see how each step ran within my little baby pipeline. And the OneLake Hub is where we can explore. So the OneLake Hub is not probably going to be used by like your data engineer persona, but more your data analyst and your business users, because they can go in and go, okay, I'm looking for a SQL Analytic endpoint because I want to query it with SQL. And what options do I have? So you see here, it's not going to give you the business definition. It's also important to name everything appropriately. So you might have, finance or HR or workforce or, sales, whatever topic might be relevant to you, so that when people are using the OneLake Hub, they can quickly go and go, oh, they told me it was in the tutorial lakehouse. Let me go have a look at what's in there that I can query. So I can go in and go, oh, yeah, there we go. SQL endpoint, I'm going to use that and copy it and go use SSMS or Azure Data Studio or Power BI or Excel to access the data. Or I'm just going to go, straight analyze it inside the browser, or I'm going to explore it with the preview feature. So the hubs are quite powerful in that you can use them to search across your tenant and find things, just not as sophisticated a search as you might be able to do with, say, the full Purview solution, where you pull all this data in, you see all the lineage, you can go through and add different glossaries and business terms and put them in collections and make it much, much more robust a solution for your org. And I think I closed my PowerPoint. I did. Let me do this. Boop, and it's back. Cool. So Lots to cover. There's a lot to go through and learn and deep dive on, and I'm sure you're going to be excited about all the different sessions throughout the conference and all the ones you've already watched. This was more of a like 50,000 foot view about how the different personas would interact with Fabric and what Fabric is and what it isn't. And thanks, David, for those of you looking what the next sessions are coming up. So we went through what a bit of an overview of Fabric is. And I do apologize. Sometimes I have a lot of assumed knowledge because I've been playing with it for about a year. I was fortunate enough to be in the private preview. So I forget all the different things to be able to explain to people as I go. We looked at the versatility that we can do with both the different business personas we might have, but also inside the product, the different personas that it makes available to be able to toggle between. So we can get those kind of shorthanded menus available and the couple of little hubs that they have. I don't use the hubs all that often as a data engineer. The monitoring hub is the main one that I use. But I also would look to do some automation. And then what I didn't show you on all this is some of the event monitoring that you can do. So with the event house and the KQL, which I didn't show, with that and you're taking your streams, there isn't actually a Fabric event stream. So if you want to know who's creating workspaces and when, you can have that in an event stream out of the box within Fabric, which is pretty cool. It doesn't support all the items yet, but I think as that grows, it gives you a bit of a different thing as opposed to doing the activity log in Office 365, which is where all the logging for Power BI went before. A lot of this logging still goes there, but the sheer fact you can build solutions on the platform to do your logging is pretty cool. You can also use, I didn't show it, but notebooks to query the data. So you can use a notebook and query the lakehouse as well if you wanted to. And actually, I'll see if I got that handy because that's a different way to look at the data. I think I put it in warehouse. I could just search for notebook one. There it is. So in this notebook, it's already pre-wired to the lakehouse. So I can go in and just say, hey, I want a new code cell. And then I'm just, for want of a better word, let's clear this. Let's say this didn't exist. So if I just go into my lakehouse and I go, hey, yeah, I want to look at this one, just drag it on, it automatically gives me the query. Pretty cool because I can just drag and drop. And then because it's using a inbuilt starter pool, it's quite quick as opposed to say Synapse, which would be about a 4-minute wait before this thing queried. Then it's going to go, 4 seconds, starts up the pool and then queries. So I can see the data and I can query using T-SQL if I wanted to, like this one has. And then I can use that data frame and do other things. And I can see it logging as it goes. So you see all that as well. Pretty cool. And it'll spinny wheel while it goes. But it means you can query with notebooks as well. If your users are more comfortable doing a notebook querying, you can. Chuck, if you go to my blog, Mike, www.heidihasting.com, should be a contact form that will send me an email. Drop it through there because I have a number of emails, but that'll work. And thanks, David. And thank you all. We are over time, but I appreciate you sticking out for the journey, and I hope you're having a great time. I know it was a lot to take in. Fabric is really, really cool. It's got its bugbears though, as you saw when I did the Lakehouse preview feature. It creates a bit of havoc for me. But I think, yeah, if you haven't already, check out the aka.ms/fabric roadmap so you can see what's coming up. It is a public roadmap. It's updated every month. It's forecasted out, 3-6 months ahead. So you can see what's coming down the radar. It's got integrations with other things, like Entra, like Azure DevOps and GitHub, like Purview. So it's not on your own. So you've got master data management integrations with Prophecy, a third party. There's 140 plus connectors. I mean, you can't. It's if you're prepared to learn with it, it's a pretty cool product. So, and with that, I better let you all go because you need to be in the other sessions learning more. But yeah, hopefully I was able to help.